Today, let's discuss the topic of America's decline, particularly focusing on how President Trump's policies have impacted both the U.S. economy and its international standing. First, let me clarify that I am neither an advocate of the Democratic Party nor overly supportive of Trump. As someone who has lived in the United States for many years, I've observed how Trump's policies, in certain ways, have propelled the U.S. toward further decline. His decisions seem to have failed to resolve the nation's challenges and, in many cases, have exacerbated America's issues. In today's analysis, we will explore how Trump's actions have affected the economy, international status, and domestic politics, examining whether his efforts to make America great again have indeed helped restore America's former glory or whether they've only hastened its decline. When Trump took office, his America First policy seemed geared toward restoring the U.S. economy, revitalizing manufacturing, and reducing foreign dependence. Trump frequently boasted that his policies were fueling economic growth, lowering unemployment, and boosting the stock market. But are these achievements truly a result of Trump's policies, or do they conceal deeper risks? Trump's tax cuts appeared to stimulate economic growth, but this came at the cost of massive fiscal deficits. According to the U.S. Department of the Treasury, during Trump's tenure, the U.S. fiscal deficit rose significantly, with a $1 trillion deficit in 2018 alone. Moreover, the tax cuts primarily benefited the wealthy and large corporations, with minimal benefits for ordinary Americans. A report from the Congressional Budget Office in 2019 indicated that Trump's tax reforms would lead to an increase in the U.S. deficit by approximately $1.9 trillion annually, potentially driving the national debt even higher over the next decade. While these policies did contribute to a short-term uptick in the stock market, their impact on ordinary households was negligible, and the widening wealth gap became a more profound issue within U.S. society. Trump's trade war, particularly with China, added more uncertainty to the U.S. economy. On the surface, his trade policies seemed aimed at protecting American interests, but in reality, they only deepened disruptions to global supply chains and led to price hikes within the U.S. economy. According to U.S. economists, the trade war caused an economic loss of nearly $70 billion, with over $20 billion in additional costs to American businesses. Trump's tariffs failed to achieve their intended goals and instead burdened American consumers with higher costs, particularly for everyday goods and electronics, directly affecting consumer spending. More importantly, Trump did little to address America's fundamental economic issues, such as the hollowing out of its manufacturing base. Despite his claims of bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., the decline of American manufacturing is not something that can be reversed overnight. Data from the U.S. Department of Labor reveals that, despite various attempts to stimulate the manufacturing sector, U.S. manufacturing employment decreased between 2016 and 2020 from 12.3 million workers to 11.7 million. America's high-tech manufacturing and production of high-value-added goods still heavily rely on overseas production, particularly in China and Southeast Asia. While Trump promised to revitalize manufacturing, the complexities of globalization made this goal far more challenging than he acknowledged. Trump's foreign policy, characterized by unilateralism, meant that America would no longer adhere to multilateralism or international norms. In today's increasingly globalized world, this approach not only strained U.S. relations with many countries, but also severely tarnished America's reputation on the global stage. Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, exit from the Iran nuclear deal, and undermining of the World Trade Organization may have seemed like efforts to protect U.S. interests. But in the long run, they diminished America's global influence. According to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, other major powers, especially China, have rapidly taken the lead in global climate governance. In 2019, China overtook the U.S. as the world's largest emitter of carbon and garnered international praise for its climate policies and technological innovations. By withdrawing from global climate talks, Trump relinquished America's voice in addressing climate change. While China leveraged initiatives like the Belt and Road to promote global green development, gradually taking over the U.S. leadership role in this field. Trump's hardline stance on U.S.-China relations may have won him support from some American voters in the short term, but in the long run, it contributed to America's increasing isolation. According to the Pew Research Center, global favorability toward the U.S. sharply declined during Trump's presidency, particularly in Europe and Asia, where trust in America reached historic lows. In 2020, only about 16% of Germans and 17% of French viewed the U.S. favorably, down from 57% and 62%, respectively, when Trump first took office. Meanwhile, China expanded its influence in international affairs, pushing for the internationalization of the renminbi and attracting more countries to engage in trade denominated in yuan. As global dependence on China grew, the dominance of the U.S. dollar faced increasing challenges. Furthermore, Trump often employed threats and coercion in dealings with allies, such as his stance on NATO, leading many traditional allies to question U.S. leadership. This erosion of trust eventually weakened America's global influence. According to the Annenberg Public Policy Center, after Trump took office, leaders of allied nations began to feel uncertain about cooperating with the U.S. And some even sought new security and diplomatic partnerships, particularly in the face of growing strategic challenges from China and Russia. At home, Trump's policies deepened America's social divisions. Issues like race relations, income inequality, and immigration became focal points during his presidency. His harsh immigration policies, including the zero-tolerance approach, led to the separation of many families, with innocent children being detained in harsh conditions. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, over 2,600 children were separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border in 2018 alone. This policy sparked widespread social opposition and international condemnation. But Trump held firm to his position, further fracturing American society along racial and political lines. According to a Harvard University survey, racial tensions and conflicts grew significantly during Trump's presidency, especially following the George Floyd incident, where Trump took no substantial steps to address racial discrimination or police violence, but instead fueled societal division through inflammatory rhetoric. Trump's economic policies have undeniably contributed to the decline of the U.S. dollar. While the dollar has traditionally been the world's reserve currency, Trump's fiscal deficits and rising national debt have placed its credibility in jeopardy. U.S. national debt surged from $19 trillion in 2016 to $28 trillion by 2020, an increase of nearly 50%. This massive debt burden has led to growing doubts about the stability of the dollar, with many countries seeking alternatives, such as the renminbi, for international trade settlements. According to the Bank for International Settlements, the share of global trade settled in dollars fell to its lowest point in nearly 30 years by 2020. Looking back on Trump's 4 years in office, it's clear that, despite some short-term economic gains, such as stock market performance and employment figures, his policies did not address America's fundamental problems. Instead, Trump's approach exacerbated the fiscal deficit, heightened concerns about the dollar's future, and diminished America's credibility and influence in international affairs. Trump's America First policy may have resonated with some voters, but his isolationist stance failed to resolve America's economic and social issues. Rather than restoring American greatness, Trump's actions have hastened the country's decline. Trump is not America's savior. He is accelerating its decline. But as the world moves forward, it's important to ask, can the U.S. recover from this trajectory? Or are we witnessing the irreversible erosion of its global influence and economic standing? And if the dollar loses its dominant role in global trade, what could this mean for the future of the global financial system? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with the notion that Trump's policies have weakened the U.S.? Or do you believe there are broader forces at play? Let's hear your perspective.